Good morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Thank you all for your continued support. We just realized that since March of 2020, we've now produced over 145 live streams on these compelling, interesting topics. All of our live streams are available for viewing on our website, so if you missed any of them, you can check them all out. Please visit our website and find out about the many opportunities you can contribute to help us keep these great live streams thriving. For those of you who have questions for Leo and Ron today, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica Deganzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program, which should start in about 30 or 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to introduce today's program, Rock Me on the Water, a conversation with Ron Brownstein and Leo Wolinsky. Ron Brownstein is many book author and senior editor of The Atlantic. Leo Wolinsky is director of CalMatters, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan news organization that produces news to serve the public interest in California. He's also a former executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, where Ron worked for many years as well. So without further ado, Leo, it's so great to have you here. This is like an LA Times reunion day.
Thanks, Kim. It's great. It does feel like a reunion with old friends. So thanks for having me.
Well, let me have you bring Ron on, and everyone wants to hear from you too. So thank you so much.
Great. Hey, Ron. Well, I have the pleasure of introducing somebody who I've come to respect and depend on for many years because of his political knowledge and his understanding of current events. Ron Brownstein, you probably watch on CNN, where he's a political analyst, and he's also senior editor of The Atlantic. I got to know Ron during his time at the Los Angeles Times when he was a national political correspondent and a columnist covering national affairs. And I really had the privilege occasionally of being able to edit Ron's pieces. And I would agree with what The Economist said about him, calling him one of America's best political journalists. So Ron has authored 7 books, including the one we're here to talk about today, Rock Me on the Water. So Ron, great to see you, even if it is virtual still at this point. You've written about cultural issues in the past, particularly with a book that you did that talked about the nexus between Hollywood and Washington, but you're really known as a political journalist. So why did you decide to delve into this cultural milieu instead of stick to the thing that you're known so much for?
Well, thanks for the question. And Leo, it is great to see you again, especially with having to go on the 101 in order to do it to downtown LA. That's like an extra bonus. I've been covering politics since the 1984 campaign. So I've covered 10 presidential campaigns. But, I think I've always covered politics. My vision of how to cover politics has always been more from the outside in than the inside out. I've never been the guy to kind of reconstruct what's happening inside the campaign, who's up, who's down, who's making the decisions. I've always been much more interested in how the political strategies and policies and agenda and messages of the parties intersect with the way the society itself is evolving. Demographically, obviously that's a lot of my writing in the last 25, 30 years, economically, but also culturally. And I have been, as you note, long kind of fascinated by the ways that politics and culture intertwine, play off of each other, evolve, and move in phase, because they usually don't move in parallel, I think. And I wrote that book 30 years ago when I lived in LA the first time, called The Power and the Glitter, which was a history of the relationship between Hollywood and politics going back to the 1920s. And anyone who writes anything about Hollywood very quickly comes to understand that the period from like roughly Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate in '67 to maybe One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Network in '75, '76, that period is considered the other golden age in Hollywood history, along with the years around World War II, basically like from Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind until It's a Wonderful Life. So when I moved back to LA in 2014, I kind of had that in my mental back pocket, that the early 70s was this period of great innovation and kind of breakthroughs in Hollywood with movies like The Godfather 1 and Godfather 2 and Chinatown and Carnal Knowledge and Five Easy Pieces and Last Picture Show. And I was kind of aware of that. And when I got out here, I started listening more than I really had at the time to the California sound of the late 60s and early 70s, Joni Mitchell, Linda Ronstadt, and Jackson Browne, and the Eagles, and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and the early part of that. And I remember thinking, huh, that's kind of interesting that all of this was happening at the same time as this movie period was kind of resurgent. But the final tumbler clicked into place for me. Very specifically, I went to a political event, fittingly enough, at Norman Lear's house. I think it must have been in 2015. He was hosting an event for Elizabeth Warren when she was beginning the exploration of running for president. And I remember leaving his house and thinking, well, you know, he was putting All in the Family and Maude and Good Times and the Jeffersons on the air at the same time as this music was happening and the movies were happening. And that's when it all kind of came together. And I began to seriously research this period. And what fascinated me about it initially was simply the observation that this was an incredible constellation of talent, that all of these things were happening at once, a transformation of television, a transformation of movies, and this real kind of apex of musical influence in Southern California. But as I got deeper into it, as we'll discuss, it became clear that there was another layer to the story, that this period of the early 70s pop culture, largely produced, predominantly produced in LA, was a hinge point in our cultural and political history, because it was the moment when a lot of the ideas that emerged out of the social movements of the 1960s were cemented into popular culture, never to be dislodged. And that became kind of the deeper current that ran through the story.
So why did this happen in Los Angeles? What was so special about LA? I mean, you have other cultural headquarters, if you will, places like New York, London, even Paris. What made Los Angeles special this way?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And, you know, I think people, first of all, the people who were part of this, whether they were in the movies, TV, or music, I think they all had a sense that they were part of something special, that something unique was happening here in all of those industries. And I think the common thread that explains why all of this happened in LA at that time was openness, really, and experimentation. I mean, people talked about, you know, whether it was Robert Towne and Warren Beatty talking to me about how they felt they had more freedom in subject matter and language and topic than any generation of filmmakers have had before, or Jackson Browne talking to me about the way that musicians and producers and executives were all mingling, kind of the barriers were breaking down. I mean, he talked about, like, you know, being in David Geffen's pool and Geffen singing show tunes, you know, badly. But also, you know, the way in which people would bring Graham Nash said, if you went to somebody's house, you brought a guitar, you know, and people were kind of sharing ideas. Rock Me on the Water, the song that is the title for the book, which I'll probably explain later why, he let Linda Ronstadt record that before he recorded it. And of course, the most famous example of this was the composition of Take It Easy, where he was kind of stalled and not even really focused on it. And Glenn Frey of the Eagles kept kind of nudging him. It was like, are you going to finish that song? Are you going to finish that song? We really want to, you know, kind of include it on our first time. He's like, well, you know, I'm not really going to get to it. And he kind of said, well, you mind if I take a crack at it? And Jackson Browne said, no, no, no. And then eventually he said, yes. And Glenn Frey came back with There's a Girl, My Lord, in a Flatbed Ford slowing down to take a look at me. And then on TV, you know, when I talked to Norman Lear, he was very aware of what Larry Gelbart was doing on MASH. And James L. Brooks was at Mary Tyler Moore was very aware of what Norman Lear was doing. And all of them felt that they were opening doors for each other. Several people described to me the experience, Irving Azoff being one, Mary Kay Place being another, Angelica Houston also in her own way, of kind of being in their early 20s and deciding in those years, all right, do I kind of pitch my tent in New York or do I pitch my tent in LA? I mean, both Azoff and Mary Kay Place literally kind of talked about being in the middle of the country and kind of debating, do I turn left or do I turn right, you know, in my Volkswagen Bug. And they all felt that LA was more open. People use words that New York was a closed shop. It was a hierarchy. And at that moment in LA, I mean, it just felt like the doors were open.
Yeah, that's incredible. But when most people think of the cultural and political foment, a period that had a lot of that, they think more about the 60s. And you concentrated on the 70s, and it was a very brief period of the 70s, and I guess everything sort of ended about the mid 70s.
Right.
And so what was so different about that period than the 60s? Was there anything?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the period of the early 70s is when the ideas that emerge on the vanguard in the 60s become mainstream, and popular culture becomes the bridge between kind of critiques of American society and American life that had emerged in the civil rights movement, and the anti-war movement, and the feminist movement, and the environmental movement, and the mass American audience. I mean, basically, if you think about things like greater suspicion of authority in both business and government, greater autonomy for women, change relationships between men and women, changing attitudes about families and sex, greater demands for inclusion from marginalized groups, African Americans, and the gay rights movement, the kind of initial stirrings of the environmental movement. All of these ideas, to one degree or another, were insurrectionary ideas in the 60s. Now they are all so much a part of our mental architecture, we cannot imagine that there was a time before them. But if you go back and you look at the pop culture of the 1960s, there was a time before these ideas were widely discussed. I mean, through the 1960s, the dominant impulse of both the networks and the movie studios in particular was to ignore everything that was happening around them. I mean, while the 60s were happening, the studios, the movie studios, were producing this procession of musicals. I mean, some of which are great movies, Mary Poppins, Sound of Music, or historical epics, The Longest Day, The Great Escape, Steve McQueen on that motorcycle, still very cool. But very much disconnected from what was happening. It really isn't until Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate in '67, and even then, the door doesn't fully open, that the movies start to engage with what is going on around them. And I really would argue that it's after Easy Rider in 1969 that it more systematically starts to connect. And then with TV, even more so. I mean, as I say in the book, Walter Cronkite would spend half an hour every night chronicling all the new fissures opening in American life, and then the networks would spend the next 3.5 hours trying to erase it from people's minds. I mean, we got, in the middle of everything happening in the 60s, what were the biggest shows on TV? The Beverly Hillbillies, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres. We didn't get any closer to Vietnam than Gomer Pyle or McHale's Navy, Hogan's Heroes. Gunsmoke was still on TV. Lucy was still on TV. Ed Sullivan was still on TV. I talk about in the book the shows that were on the night of the Kent State shootings on CBS. It was Gunsmoke, Andy Griffith, Doris Day, and Lucy Ball, as shows that all have their roots in one way or another back into the 50s. But what changed, the pivot, so through the 60s, as these movements are emerging, the networks and the studios are completely looking away from them. Music is being pulled more toward them more quickly because it relies more on young people. And what essentially happened, the story I tell, is that in the early 70s, the fear of losing this enormous younger audience, the baby boom, and the first, basically the baby boom, with the largest generation in American life at that point, forced both the studios and the television networks to tear down the walls that they had erected between themselves and what was happening in the society. So the early 70s becomes the moment in which these ideas become mainstream. They become embedded in popular culture, never really to be dislodged. Even though, as we can discuss, Nixon won 2 elections, paradoxically won 2 elections, precisely by mobilizing the people who were the least happy about the way society was changing. He couldn't actually stop the changes. I mean, once these ideas became mainstream in popular culture, they became infused in the way we live.
Yeah, that's quite true. And yet at the same time, you write how this period was very brief, actually, and sort of ended in the mid 70s. And what caused it to break apart in that very brief period of time?
So, I think the critical, obviously there's a lot going on at any given moment in movies, television, and music. But I do think there is a common thread that runs through the most memorable and impactful pop culture of the early 1970s. And it was the question of what of the ideals of the 60s could be sustained in the very different political and social environment of the 1970s. And this was the issue that was being, debated. I mean, All in the Family reduced to one living room, the generation gap of the 60s. And every week, in effect, what you watched was the terms of surrender by the older generation, embodied by Archie, to the cultural and social mores, of not necessarily the political mores, but the cultural and social mores demanded by the younger generation, embodied by Mike and Gloria, and then all of the kind of diverse America that they would kind of bring in to interact with Archie. And that was the story that we were watching in the early 70s. We were essentially, I think, in much of this pop culture, whether it's Chinatown with its kind of view of America as kind of rotten at the core and fundamentally corrupt, or The Godfather 2, or The Conversation that told those stories, or some of the others like Five Easy Pieces earlier that told that was essentially what we were debating. And I think what happened by the mid 70s was a couple things. One, there began to be the first stirrings of the backlash to the increased freedom that we were seeing, the really kind of proto-emergence of the religious right against things like the abortion that Maude had on the spin-off show from All in the Family. But the deeper thing was that the audience itself, I think, kind of lost its enthusiasm for relitigating the argument of the 60s. We kind of established a new baseline. It became clear that we were not going to have fundamental social revolution the way that many of the activists of the 60s envisioned, but it was also clear we weren't going back to the 50s, that we were going to be living our lives in a slightly different way, in a very different way, in terms of all the things we were talking about: attitudes of authority, relations between men and women, the role of previously marginalized groups. And I think once that new equilibrium kind of established, the audience stomach for kind of the contemporary, the relitigating of these arguments diminished, and you saw pop culture kind of diverge. What happened on TV and movies was kind of the return to kind of pure entertainment. And in the movies, it was often brilliant, pure entertainment, Jaws and Star Wars and Raiders of the Lost Ark. On TV, it was Happy Days replacing All in the Family as the #1 show on TV in 1976, which was almost too perfect as we kind of go back to the 50s. We do not want to be locked in that living room with the bunkers fighting out the 60s every week. We're just going to go all the way back to the 50s, where none of this was even an issue. And then in music bifurcates. On the one hand, it gets grittier and more nihilistic and pessimistic with the punk movement. And on the other, it goes in that kind of more pure entertainment escapist vein with the rise of disco. But in all of it, it's basically, I think by the mid 70s, you can see the audience, essentially saying, all right, we're done. And also the economic rewards obviously changed too, with the blockbusters becoming such the roulette wheel could pay out so much higher than Hollywood had ever envisioned before.
Yeah. Ron, I grew up in the barrios of East LA, and I was kind of a cub reporter during the period that you describe here. And there were a lot of cultural stirrings in minority communities,
Yes.
in Central and Black areas and in the Latino areas. And how much of a factor was that here? And you don't see as much of it from this point of view.
Yeah, right. It's interesting. What I was writing about were basically the exported culture from LA, the music, movies, and TV products that were then broadcast to a national and even global audience, and thus help shape perceptions and viewpoints. Mary Tyler Moore, for example, on The Changing Role of Women, or MASH about attitudes toward authority in the military and Vietnam. And as you say, there was quite a bit of some of which is chronicled in that book, Like the Night on Fire by Mike Davis. There's quite a bit happening in LA, but very little of it got through the funnel of the kind of gatekeepers who controlled access to that big national audience. And this was a fascinating period in terms of diversity in the entertainment industries, because on the one hand, you do see the first kind of cracking open the door toward telling the stories of other than white nuclear families. So you get Sanford and Son and Good Times and The Jeffersons and Chico and the Man, and in its own way, the Mary Tyler Moore Show, about a single woman in her 30s who they would not let be divorced. CBS would not let her be divorced. She had to be, I don't know why it was better that she was, coming off of living with her boyfriend, but they would not let her be divorced when the show started. And then, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore in movies, A Woman Under the Influence. So you see the first kind of opening of the door to telling the stories of, or including the perspective of characters other than kind of the white nuclear family. But the people who controlled the telling of those stories were still overwhelmingly white men. I mean, there were very few, astonishingly few women directors and writers. And I tell the story of some of those pioneers, Joan Darling, Mary Kay Place, Linda Bloodworth, and there were very, very few people of color in kind of anywhere, except for this one kind of strange, highly controversial and divisive, subgenre of what became known as the blaxploitation movies. I mean, hundreds of movies like Shaft and Superfly and all the Coffee and Foxy Brown, all the Pam Grier movies, in which on the one hand created a lot of work for Black actors and directors and craftspeople, and also put on the screen confident, independent, forceful Black protagonists who often took vengeance on corrupt white society in a way that had not previously been represented on screen before. But on the other hand, were B movies with all the sex and violence and stereotypes that implied, and which drew intense protests from civil rights groups at the time, even as people like Gordon Parks Sr. Defended them. That was a kind of a very controversial, kind of offshoot of all this. But the big arc of the early 70s is you begin to see the willingness and the need to tell other stories, but who's telling those stories is still largely the same people. Right. Literally, in the case, in many of the Norman Lear shows, he would have, I mean, he had kind of a go-to kind of, older white comedy writers with kind of links in either the 50s, the great 50s variety shows, or kind of Catskills music comedy traditions, kind of the Mrs. Maisel era. And people like that end up running Good Times, which is, became a source of endemic conflict with the cast.
I'll bet. So right now we're living through a period of great social foment. There's racial and social justice movements, there's political polarization all over the place. Do you see any parallels between what we're seeing now and what happened about that time?
Absolutely. I think this is as close to a parallel, I think, as you can get, if you think about it this way. I mean, to me, the story of the early 1970s is that the giant baby boom influenced culture before it influenced politics. That the entertainment industries reshape themselves to reflect the values and experiences and priorities of this emerging generation, because it was a big part of their audience and they couldn't ignore them. And as I noted before, the irony or paradox is that even as those perspectives, the ideas that we were talking about, suspicion of authority, autonomy for women, inclusion of marginalized groups, even as those ideas are triumphing in popular culture, Richard Nixon is winning 2 elections in 68 and 72 by mobilizing his silent majority, which is essentially the voters who are the most uncomfortable about precisely the same changes that are cementing in popular culture. And I think it's not totally surprising. The electorate is older and whiter than the country. It's always been older and whiter than the country. It probably always will be older and whiter than the country overall. And what that means is at any given moment, you may be able to coalesce a winning political coalition by promising to stop the cultural change that big parts of older, whiter America find discomforting. what you can't actually do is stop the change, okay? And, Nixon won twice, Reagan won twice, and at the end of that, we didn't go back to the 1950s, right? I mean, minorities didn't go back to accepting, casual discrimination or exclusion without forceful demands. Women didn't go back. We didn't go back to Donna Reed, and father knows best. And I think there is much the same is happening now. A majority of Americans at this point have been born since 1981. The millennials were the most diverse generation in American history until Generation Z, which is now the most diverse generation in history. The generation born after 2014 will be the first generation in American history that are majority people of color. And if you look at the pop culture that these generations are consuming, creating, and demanding, even look at the movies that emerged, in the key categories in the Oscars this year, which may have been the greatest concentration of socially aware movies in one Oscar since this period I'm writing about in the early 70s. If you look at all the pop culture, whether it's music on the Grammys or the TV that's emerging on kind of the streaming revolution, all of it has a vision of inclusion, of not only acceptance but celebration of difference that goes way beyond where we have been before. And I think that, much like the pop culture of the 70s was a pretty good guide to how we'd be living in the 80s and 90s, I think that is a very good guide to how we'll be living in the 2030s and 2040s. I don't think we're going to be arguing about transgender rights in 10 years. We may be arguing about something else, but I don't think we're going to be arguing about that. And that doesn't mean the left is always going to win elections by any means, but it does mean that the culture is going to evolve toward the preferences of these younger generations, which show up in culture before they do in politics. And in that way, I think we are in exactly the same kind of dynamic. Trump, as Nixon showed, you can mobilize a lot of people by promising to stop the change. I think, like Nixon and Reagan, he's going to find that, Republicans and others like Trump are going to find out that even if you can win elections, you can't stop the change.
You know what I find most interesting about that? This whole notion that, that these forces of cultural revolution had defeated the conservative forces that were dragging everybody back. And yet today, many of the same baby boomers who came of age in that period had formed the base of Trump's support. It seems like a great contradiction there.
Well, it's interesting. The social movements of the 60s were driven by the left side of the baby boom. Mostly the college side of the baby boom, and obviously by people of color in the civil rights movement, and then older folks who agreed with them. But there always was another piece. The very first exit polls that were ever done were done in 1972, and Richard Nixon in 1972 won most white people under 30. It's pretty astonishing. I mean, most people don't think about it that way because of McGovern, and obviously McGovern had a lot of youth support in the primary, but Nixon won most white people under 30. So there was always another part of the baby boom. And the baby boom is 80% white because there was no immigration between 1924 and 1965 until we revised the immigration laws. And so there was always this conservative piece, and that has become more prominent as we have gone. I mean, I think that there is probably some instance of folks moving to the right as they go politically, but mostly it was kind of always there and overshadowed, by the activist side of the baby boom. But it was, even though the active, as I talk about in the book, whether you're talking about Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda or Jerry Brown, I mean, the activist side of the baby boom, and Brown is older than the baby boom because he was in seminary. He kind of comes out and he's marinated in the 60s. He would, in a way, he would not have been. His sister Kathleen said to me he was kind of in suspended animation for 3 years, and then he kind of. But if you think about the activist side of the baby boom, they did not achieve their grandest goals of kind of, fundamental reconstruction of our society, but they did change the way we live, and they changed the way they changed kind of our mental architecture in important ways. I mean, the role of women, attitudes about the environment, trust in government and business, demands for inclusion of groups that had previously been excluded. Those things were very different after the 1960s, and after, as I argue, they were embedded into popular culture in the early 1970s. American society changed on all of those fronts. And even the kind of the pushback that occurred, the backlash that you talk about in the late 70s and in the Reagan years, never really changed those new assumptions. Is why conservatives often say that even when we win the White House, we've lost the culture. And I think the early 70s is the moment where that became, demonstrably true.
Yeah. Ron, the business models of television, movies, music, they've all been pretty much savaged by the technology to come up, at least the business models that had existed in the past. And all these entertainment companies have been consolidating and people are being laid off and whatnot. Yet, when you drive around Hollywood these days, you really feel this huge resurgence in business.
Yes.
Oprah Winfrey moved her studios out here. You have the streaming companies like Netflix all over the place.
Apple, yeah.
All these warehouses are again being converted into soundstage.
Right.
So what's up here in Los Angeles? Do you see that we're on the cusp of another major comeback here? Or?
I actually think there are a lot of positive trends. I mean, I think you have two things that are intersecting in a way that could produce something really striking in the 2020s. Actually, three things. One, you have more political pressure for inclusion and for telling more diverse stories. And unlike the 70s, not only telling more diverse stories, but having those stories told by more diverse storytellers, right? I mean, that's very different. That is rooted in the same dynamic that I was writing about, which is the change in the audience, right? As I said, a majority of the country now was born after 1981, and these are the most diverse generations in American history. And that is the audience increasingly that these companies have to appeal to, and they are going to have to produce entertainment that reflects the experiences, priorities, and values of those emerging consumers. It's inexorable, right? I mean, the future always gets the last word in that sense. And then the third factor that's kind of converging here is that the streaming revolution is changing the economics of production, both in terms of most dramatically in terms of movies, but even for TV. Programs can be a success now without attracting a mass audience. And as great as Jaws and Star Wars and all of its progeny are, and I am a Marvel Comics guy since I owned Avengers #4 with the return of Captain America. So I have nothing against Marvel, but as great as all of that is, there's a certain imprisoning nature of every movie, needing to make $300 or $400 or $500 million to break even because it's such a gargantuan production. And you are getting back to a period where it is possible to, at smaller budgets, tell stories that are focused more on a particular experience. And as I said, if you think about what were at the top of the Oscars nominations this year: Nomadland, Promising Young Woman, Judas and the Black Messiah, One Night in Miami, Minari, and so forth. And you can see how all of these things come together in a way that allow for a return to kind of the socially aware filmmaking that we had in the early 1970s. In a broader sense, the demand for content, the insatiable demand for content, is going to be really good for LA at the top line. I mean, the challenge is, like every other city that is booming in the information age economy, whether it's Seattle or Denver or Boston or Austin or Brooklyn, it's the same problem with all of them, inequality. And even as you are creating just tremendous opportunity, have you created a structure, an educational system, a job training system that allows the kids from your low income and minority neighborhoods to compete for the jobs that you are creating? John Hickenlooper years ago described that when he was the mayor of Denver, now the senator from Colorado. He described that as the Denver paradox. Our quality of life and our economy is so good, we're attracting people from all over the world to come live here, but we can't get our own kids from black and brown neighborhoods on a track to compete for those jobs. It's true in Chicago, it's true in New York, it's true in Austin, it's true in Seattle, it's certainly true in LA. And that, I think, ultimately is the big challenge for all of the big blue metros in America.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the challenge that we see out there in the streets every day. Well, Ron, we want to leave plenty of time for questions. I think we have a big audience out there. So why don't I turn it back over to Jessica now and see what the audience has to say.
Great. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Ron, our first question: Rock Me on the Water is a 1972 song by Jackson Browne. Why this one? He had a 1974 album, Late for the Sky, with songs like The Road and the Sky, Before the Deluge, Farther On, The Late Show. So why a song from 1972?
Yeah. So, I was and obviously I write a lot about all of those songs in the 1974 album, and I tell the story of the making of that album. Rock Me on the Water originally appealed to me. It kind of followed my own evolution of the book, right? So Rock Me on the Water originally appealed to me at the title because it conveyed openness. Like the song, I'm going to get down to the sea somehow, where the sisters of the sun are going to rock me on the water. The song sounds like you are driving down the Santa Monica freeway to the PCH with a surfboard sticking out of the back of your convertible. It just has that openness that I felt was so central to what was happening in LA in those years. But as I got deeper into the story, and this other layer kind of increasingly revealed itself to me in terms of this being the hinge point in which many of these ideas from the 60s were cemented into popular culture, I became more committed to the song, because Rock Me on the Water, as I write about in the book, is the first of 3 songs on each of the first 3 Jackson Browne albums that grappled directly with what I said to you before, I believe was the central question of pop culture of the early 1970s, which was what of the ideals of the 60s could be preserved in this new political environment. And in Rock Me on the Water, he is still largely optimistic, right? I mean, if you recall the lyrics, it's, oh, people, look among you. It's there your hope must lie. We are, it's sort of that Andy Rooney, Judy Garland, let's go put our shot. We're going to do this. Come on, people. We are going to do this. The road is filled with homeless souls, every woman, child, and man. They have no idea where they will go, but they will help you if they can. I mean, it's still, and the music is gospel powered. It's propulsive. Like, yes, towers are turning, walls are burning, but we are still going to do this. The second album, the title song, is For Every Man. And on For Every Man is his metaphor for the communal movements of the 1960s. And by that song, he's starting to have a little more doubt. And he's still waiting for every man, which is the change that we're all organizing to bring. But he allows that he may be left only, in a great image, holding sand by waiting for that. And then, of course, as you note, on the third album, which is the one I write about the most, Late for the Sky, there's Before the Deluge. And by Before the Deluge, he's feeling pretty pessimistic. And his generation is no more likely than any other to escape the kind of biblical and environmental cataclysm that he kind of very cinematically portrays in that final song. The title taken from an Otto Friedrich book that Linda Ronstadt gave him, but the kind of the imagery taken from the Paul Ehrlich environmental doom books of the early 70s. And then kind of you go forward to The Pretender in the mid 70s, even more pessimistic, when he says, when he talks about the changes we were waiting for, were they only the fitful dreams of some greater awakening? And all of this seems just evaporated. But as I say in the book, and why, again, the Rock Me on the Water felt so perfect, was that as Jackson Browne went forward in his life, as he continued in his career and his life, he found ways to look forward more often than he looked back. And he found ways to connect to new causes more often than to lament what hadn't been achieved. And I think that in many ways, that was the transition. I talk about it in the lives of Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda at great length. That was the transition that so much of the activist side of the baby boom from the 60s went through, which was, yes, we are not going to achieve our dreams of transforming the society, but how do we make a positive contribution in our lives and our families and our communities? And so anyway, long story short, I felt Rock Me on the Water really put us on that arc, put us on that journey, which ultimately is really at the center of the book.
Thank you. Can you speak more about the relationships between politicians and the entertainment industry, in particular about how politicians have used entertainment to advocate for particular policies, and some specific examples?
Yeah, well, there are really two ways, there are two levels on which politicians interact with the entertainment industry. There's one in which they pursue tangible help, money and celebrity appearances. And as I wrote in my previous book, The Power and the Glitter, this goes all the way back to Louis Mayer and Herbert Hoover, like the M and MGM, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. That Louis Mayer was a close ally of Herbert Hoover in the 1920s and the leading Republican in Hollywood. and prized for his ability to deliver William Randolph Hearst to Herbert Hoover. And then obviously, you know, as you go through the 30s and 40s, Roosevelt really activates liberal Hollywood, and then it goes into kind of retreat in the blacklist era, reemerges with JFK in 1960 and Frank Sinatra, who provided all sorts of services to the incoming president, some of which yeah, we only learned about after after JFK was gone. And then the social movements of the 60s swept in a lot of activists. Marlon Brando, Harry Belafonte were very involved in the civil rights movement. Paul Newman was a huge asset, one of really the first assets for Eugene McCarthy in 1968 when he was running against LBJ, and hardly any elected officials would endorse him. He relied on Hollywood help, and I tell a lot of those stories in the Power of the Glitter. Even in the period that I'm writing about here in the early 70s, there was what was known as the Malibu Mafia, which you know, Harold Meyerson actually just wrote about in the LA Times this week. I mean, the kind of group of people, some of them in the entertainment industry, like Norman Lear and Ted Ashley, and others like Harold Willens and Max Palevsky, who became this real center of kind of liberal fundraising in the early 1970s, critical in George McGovern's campaign. Warren Beatty was critical in that, and also critical in the election of Tom Bradley in 1973. So there's this whole history, you know, going back to the 1920s, almost 100 years now. Al Jolson campaigned for Republicans in the 1920s, for God's sake, of kind of tangible help. But then there's the other kind of lane, which is how politicians draw on or play off of the changes in the culture that are reflected in popular culture. And you can see kind of the backlash strategies of you know, whether Nixon or Reagan, or even now when people talk about cancel culture or woke culture, there is always an audience for essentially saying that what you, my target audience, think of as real American culture is under threat, is being undermined by some new generation's expressions of what it means to be an American and what their priorities are. That is always there, that will always be there, but the reverse is always also true. Like I show in the book how Jerry Brown in 1974, when he gets elected governor of California, amazingly succeeding Ronald Reagan, really, along with Gary Hart that same year in Colorado, is the first effort to bring into the political system some of the same ideas about suspicion of authority and environmentalism and inclusion that were transforming the pop culture of the time. And you can see the same process going on. He's working through the same process that I described Jackson Brown is working through, which is what of the ideals of the 60s can still be made relevant here in the 70s and sold in a way that can get you 50+1 of the vote. So it really always, both of those levels are going on at once, the tangible and kind of the immaterial, the kind of the ethereal cultural change, and how politicians respond to that.
Thank you. This next questioner says, Ron, it was a great book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. You document the somewhat uncritical embrace of the Black Panthers by the Hollywood left. Mm-hmm. Do you see similarities with today's support of the more radical elements of the BLM movement, and to the extent the country became tired of relitigating the issues of the 1960s? Will today's generation simply get tired of being called racist and move on?
So the story about, I mean, the Black Panthers in the early 1970s were not kind of a widespread cause in Hollywood. They were at kind of the absolute vanguard. And I tell the story of Bert Schneider, who was one of the founders of what BBS, which was the closest thing to the indie films world of the late 60s and early 70s, the company that produced Easy Rider and 5 Easy Pieces and The Last Picture Show. And ultimately Hearts and Minds, the one great Hollywood documentary of the period on Vietnam, maybe the one ever on Vietnam. He was a devotee of the Black Panthers, a big supporter, very close to Huey Newton. And I tell this kind of, kind of cockamamie story, which would be kind of funny if it wasn't so tragic, of Bert Schneider and his friends basically spiriting Huey Newton out of the country in August 1974 to beat a murder rap in Oakland, and as kind of a high point in many ways of what Tom Wolfe would call radical chic. But it was never a widespread cause in Hollywood, and Schneider was seen as someone who was out there on the edge. You know, if you think about today, I think, look, this is the fight we are going to be having. I mean, it's pretty clear that Republican and conservative politicians will be arguing that many of the demands for inclusion that the new generations are pushing forward more aggressively basically is a zero-sum game. And it means that you, older white America, will lose if these groups are given more of a seat at the table in every institution in American life. You know, Democrats will be kind of balancing between meeting the demands for inclusion and trying to make the argument that all of society will benefit, sort of the Heather McGhee argument in her book about racism. All of society will benefit if more of the talents you know, a wider range of talents are given a chance to develop. And I think that is going to be a fundamental conflict in the decade ahead. I think that, as I said, I think the future always gets the last word. And I think that the views in the younger generations about what constitutes inclusion, about what constitutes acceptable behavior in the workplace, about what constitutes acceptable speech, you can win elections by promising to make all that go away, as I said, but I still think that is going to be the way we are living in 10 years.
How will today's pop culture influence what younger generations will aspire to, if not anchoring to previous generations? Who is today's Norman Lear?
So, there, you know, in the same way there is no Walter Cronkite and there is no Johnny Apple at the New York Times or David Broder, there probably can't be a Norman Lear anymore, because Norman Lear, as Bob Hope said, you know, I think like 1973, 74, one of the Emmys, you know, we can all be proud of television and its new owner, Norman Lear. You know, at that point, the audiences were so big and so concentrated. You know, All in the Family may have been watched by 40 million people every week. And, you know, and that was only the beginning. He had Maude and Good Times and the Jeffersons, and later One Day at a Time, and Sanford and Son on NBC. So the concentrated influence just it's not going to happen again. There isn't going to be that person any more than there's going to be. Who's Walter Cronkite now? You know, I love Nora O'Donnell. I love Anderson Cooper. You know, I don't know, but I respect Lester Holt. I mean, they're not Walter Cronkite, right? Peter Baker is a brilliant print journalist and probably the person whose position is closest to that, but he's not Johnny Apple, you know, R.W. Apple Jr. for the, you know, or David Broder. The job just doesn't exist anymore in this fractionated media environment. So I think, you know, there's obviously, you know, tremendously influential producers and showrunners, and Shonda Rhimes and Danny Glover, and, you know, and the creators of things like, you know, Breaking Bad and Mad Men. But I don't think there is that person anymore, because I don't think the structure, the economic structure of the industries allow it.
This next one's for both Ron and Leo. How have you seen Hollywood entertainment transform journalism? And do you think that readers' expectations of narrative and entertainment have diminished the quality of news coverage, both on cable news and in written news?
All right, Leo, I've been talking, you jump in.
Well, you know, I think that that entertainment coverage in some ways has taken over a lot of news, because to some degree it's seen as something you can monetize more. That said, you don't see in entertainment coverage very much is very hard-edged coverage. You know, the political aspects of entertainment and the investigative stories that happen there. I think you tend to see a lot of fluff, a lot of soft stuff to this day. And I think if entertainment coverage is really going to have an impact, it's going to have that harder edge. That's just my view.
If I understand the question, you know, you're asking if the model, whether news is being shaped by the desire to be more like entertainment. I actually don't think that's the way news is being reshaped. I think it's being reshaped to be more like sports. And as the country has gotten more rigidly polarized into red and blue, all news organizations are basically kind of treating the politics and policy and kind of really national life as a competition, almost like a sports competition between red and blue. Most media organizations are finding that their audience tilts very heavily toward one side or the other, which kind of pulls them in the direction, I mean, not so much rooting for one side, but covering that side's concerns. I mean, if you turn on Fox at any given moment, it is a different world than watching MSNBC or CNN, or for that matter, even kind of mainstream newspapers in terms of what it's talking about every day. And so I feel like, it's much more of a sports metaphor where, red and blue are jockeying to run the country, to control the direction of the country. And the media is being forced first to kind of report on the status of that competition, but also the audiences. Fox is such a dark star or a black hole, pulling in so much of right of center Americans that everybody else's audience, I think, is pulled the other way as a result of those viewers being removed. I remember when I was working at the LA Times, and I starting, say, in the late 80s or early 90s, in my head, maybe infused by editors like Leo or the great John Carroll or Roger Smith or some of our other old colleagues, like my imaginary reader was a undecided voter who was trying to figure out what they thought about whatever I was writing about. Okay, I don't think that's the way most journalists think anymore. I think they think that their typical reader is a red or blue partisan who wants to know how their side is doing. And that to me is the change, and that is the evolution toward the sports metaphor. I mean, the vast majority of people reading the sports page of the LA Times are not neutral on the Dodgers. I mean, they're not trying to figure out whether or not they like the Dodgers. They know they like the Dodgers, and they want to know how the Dodgers are doing. And that's what I feel like most readers are in terms of the sides of red and blue at this point.
Right. Can you talk about some of the downsides of the 1970s California culture spreading across the country that we're still experiencing today? And by what standards do you measure that a culture is progressing or regressing?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, as I said before, we only cracked the door toward greater inclusion in the early 1970s, and it was still a man's world. I mean, it was still a white man's world. And even though more of the stories of women and people of color were being told, they weren't telling them by and large. Very, very few, as I document in the book. I also talk in the book about the drug culture, which, if the pushback from social conservatives somewhat bigger, the shift in the audience demand and the willingness to relitigate the 60s, if those were the big external forces that kind of cut off this gold magic hour in LA in the early 1970s, the big internal one was drugs above all, and sort of a culture of license and anything goes. When Roman Polanski was arrested a few years later for having sex with a 13-year-old in Jack Nicholson's basement, that's captured. Angelica Houston said to me, like, who got arrested too in the bargain when police came and found drugs in her belongings. She said, like, it wasn't that unusual. Like, she was kind of shocked that he got arrested when so many powerful men were doing exactly that. And obviously the cocaine culture in the mid 70s was really debilitating. Didn't so much affect TV, but in movies and music, it was burning like a wildfire. And, and this gets to kind of the larger issue of the 60s. The costs of people escaped the strictures that existed before then, and obviously had greater personal freedom in every possible way. I mean, that is an enormous cultural change in a period of roughly 15 years, from the early 60s to the mid 70s. But there are costs to that. There are costs that we're still paying today in terms of relationships and drug abuse and commitment. And what I find really interesting about some of the, in particular, the Late for the Sky Jackson Browne album, is that you see, and The Pretender, you see the artists beginning to grapple with these questions of maybe there's a cost to all of this freedom that we've won. Shampoo has that. Shampoo is a movie that I write about at length, and on one hand, it just seems to be this kind of celebration of sexual calisthenics. I mean, Warren Beatty in the movie sleeps with I think 4 different women over the 24 hours of the movie, but at the end, he's left alone and in despair, and the woman he loves is gone to him, much like in Chinatown, which was written by Town as well, right before. So there is an awareness in the pop culture that even at the time, that the freedom we are celebrating, and in many ways the freedom that the freedom that in most respects we feel has enlarged our life, might have costs of its own.
Thank you. And just a follow up to that, does the culture of Hollywood with its abuse, nepotism, staunch hierarchy, sexism, and power imbalances really bode well for how to direct our national culture and politics? It seems like it's nice to have a Hollywood in your nation, but not to let your nation be led by Hollywood types and those who elevate them too much.
Well, Hollywood didn't, first of all, Hollywood did not lead the cultural changes that I'm writing about. Hollywood eventually caught up to them and reflected them because they realized it was in their economic interest to do so. And you could argue the same thing is happening now, where, as I said before, the combination of the streaming revolution, which reduces the need for every movie to make hundreds of millions of dollars, and an audience that is more diverse than ever, is pressuring them to open the doors wider to a different range of storytellers. And I think that will be a positive, but ultimately we will see whether the people at the top of the pyramid ultimately reflect. I mean, we've gone from the stories in front of the camera increasingly reflecting diverse experiences to the people telling those stories now becoming somewhat more diverse. We haven't yet gotten to the point where the people who are actually running things are that much more so, and we will see whether that happens. But I don't think, I never, at no point in this do I look at Hollywood or TV as leading the cultural change. They are catching up to it and consolidating it by being the bridge that takes it to the mass American audience.
Well, thank you so much. That was a very, very quick hour. So Ron, great to have you back. Leo, thank you so much for leading this conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Oh, those are terrific questions, and Ron, you've been generous with your time and great answers to these questions. But I have one more to throw at you. End this thing. And it's a quick one. It could even have a yes or no answer, depending how you feel. So these days we see a real rise in sensitivity to racial references. There are kinds of claims of cancel culture, talk of microaggressions you hear all the time. Given all that, do you think a modern day version of All in the Family could be produced today?
Probably not. Probably not. And that's a loss. But I do think in the long run, the edges will kind of get negotiated out, but younger generations will decide how they want to be addressed and what is acceptable as a way of, kind of interacting in any kind of public setting. And I think these are, what people are describing as cancel culture or wokeness. The fullest extremes may not be the case in 10 years, but that is the direction. I think that, to me, the big lesson is that the cultural change reflected in younger generations is the forecast of how we're going to be living, not necessarily the way the politics, who's going to win elections, but how we are going to be living. And there are losses in that, and we need to figure out a way that that people feel respected, but that something like All in the Family could get on the air. We're not there yet, but I have a lot of confidence we will be. I think these are terrific younger generations, and I think they're going to make this a better country.
Great. Well, thanks, Ron. Been a terrific discussion, and Kim, we'll turn it back to you.
This was such a fun, insightful, just entertaining discussion. It could have gone on for so much longer. What was that old expression that if you remember the 60s, you really weren't there? We have to the one from the 70s. We were there. We remember this all. Thank you both so very much. This was terrific. And a video of this will be posted on our website in 24 hours. So I want to send it out to all of our former LA Times friends. So
Thank you all for doing this. Really, Leo, thank you. Great questions, and Kim, thank you for the forum. I love being here.
Thank you. Take care.